spend some time with you. Thank you for taking some time to spend time with us. I think we'll start off by introducing our executive. For a lot of the people in our community, you haven't had a chance maybe to meet everyone. So I've got a little presentation here we'll put together to show everybody. And let me just share my screen here. So our first executive member is Michelle Ferry. Michelle's been in Ipperwash for a long time, and really the reason why we're having tonight's virtual meeting was her spearheading this, and this is a great opportunity. You see Michelle, make sure you say hi. And, next up on our executive board, we have Ian McDonald. He is one of our newest members and has been a longtime resident and visitor of Ipperwash. And he's a great guy. He's got lots of great jokes. So if you get a chance to say hi to him, make sure you say hi. John Arnold, a longtime owner and visitor to Ipperwash as well. Also one of our volunteers on our board. And he's hosting tonight's meeting. John's been on the executive for 6 years. Next, we have Jim McGuire, also volunteer and on our board, new to our board this year. New to Ipperwash, but been here a long time visiting. And you always find him out and about in the beach, picking up garbage and stuff. So make sure you say hi when you see him around. John Kidd, unfortunately, I didn't have a picture for John, but John's been a long time resident here, obviously. Third generation, and his family have owned property in Ipperwash since 1917. John's been a big help over the years to maintain the gateway signs when you come into Ipperwash, keeping them sturdy and well constructed, as well as cleaned up. Jerry Rupke. Jerry's been here a long time and been very instrumental in Ipperwash activities, both as a council member, as well as being on our board for many years in a couple different terms. And then myself, I've been coming here to Ipperwash my entire life, and just recently I've made this my part-time residence. So if I'm not working in London, I'm here at the beach. And my stepdad and myself both have been members with the SICA board. So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight and spending time with us. I think most of you got notice about this meeting through our newsletter. Please make sure you share that with your friends and family so that they know about how to stay in touch with Ipperwash, and encourage them to be a member, because in membership, having large numbers, it really helps us when we have times that we have to sit in front of council or local officials to let them know that we are the voice for Ipperwash. So I'm going to turn this over to Michelle, and Michelle has organized this evening for us with our speakers. So Michelle.
Thanks, Brent. I'm really excited about this evening, and seeing so many people out is just so wonderful, and actually seeing some faces and names that go together. So it's great seeing everybody. I'm very excited and pleased to introduce our guest speakers. We have Emily Declue and Daniela Clisper. I'm hoping that's close, and Jesse Van Zalt. They're all from the conservation area. I'll start with Emily. Emily's a water resource specialist at St. Clair Regional Conservation Authority. Her main role includes maintaining meteorological equipment and analyzing data as part of her flood forecasting and warning duties. Emily uses this information to communicate with municipalities and the public about flood events, including recent interviews with the Weather Network and CBC Radio. Emily holds a Bachelor of Environmental Studies in Geography and Environmental Management from the University of Waterloo, and an Environmental Technician Diploma from Fleming College. When not working, Emily enjoys hiking and tapping into her creative side with the flute. So we're excited to have Emily. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Daniela as well, if that's okay, and then you can just follow along. So Daniela is a coastal stewardship coordinator. Daniela most recently completed her master's degree in water security from the University of Saskatchewan, where she studied drainage and its impacts on nutrient loading into surface water. She also holds a Bachelor of Honors Environmental and Resource Science from Trent University. Her environmental career began in shoreline assessments in Haliburton County while engaging with waterfront property owners and providing shoreline education. In the northwest of Ontario, she worked with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and with First Nations group. Danielle spends her spare time cycling and paddling and angling, and she's interested in arts and culture. And I'm just so proud to introduce these most accomplished women and looking forward to hearing them speak. And I'm going to pass it on to Jess if she would like to speak, or she wants to speak at the end.
I can speak at the end, but probably I'll wrap things up.
Okay, so
Thanks.
I think Emily, if you would go ahead, we're looking forward to hearing you speak.
For sure. If I miss anything, I'm sure Jess will use her time at the end to fill you in, because I know she'd love that. Let me just share my screen here. We can all see that?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so I have a tendency to overtalk, so if it's getting close to my 15-minute mark, just interrupt me. But I wanted to touch on water levels, particularly in the Lake Huron region. If you've missed it, past couple years have been pretty interesting when it comes to water levels. So I'm gonna give you the brief intro to water levels. So just jump right into it. I like to start with who we are. Because I know sometimes people think of conservation authorities and they see just one aspect of us, but there are many conservation authorities in Ontario. There's 36 of us, and we're based on natural watershed or drainage boundaries rather than your political or municipal boundaries. We are a unique system to Ontario, and we were established under the Conservation Authorities Act in 1946. So we actually go back quite far. In the 30s and 40s, there was a lot of environmental degradation that was happening, and recreational users like canoeists, fishers, and farmers were very vocal about the degradation happening. So that's how conservation authorities were born, a way to kind of get nature back to where it needed to be. And then Hurricane Hazel happened in 1954. The particular event is quite interesting in that it came up into Canada. It was no longer a hurricane, but the system stalled over Toronto and released a significant amount of precipitation, which led to very quickly rising water levels in the rivers, which flooded homes that had been built close to rivers within those watersheds. So many houses were actually lost, and 81 lives were lost as well. There was a significant loss to infrastructure, costing millions of dollars in the 50s. So you can imagine what that would be in today's numbers. But after Hurricane Hazel, we saw further establishment of conservation authorities. So we were actually a bit later to the game. We started in 1961 as the Sydenham Valley for the Sydenham River. We then became St. Clair Region in the 1970s to include the St. Clair River and Lake St. Clair to recognize those within our watershed as well. So our large watershed consists of 14 smaller watersheds or smaller drainage areas, which equates to over 4,100 kilometers squared. And we serve a population of over 167,000 people. Our structure within the organization consists of 8 different departments. So I'm sure you are familiar with some of the things we do, such as our planning and regulations team, regulate flood-prone areas. They're the ones you talk to when you want to build something to ensure that you aren't going to do anything that would, hurt your property or put you at risk for flooding and erosion. Water resources, which is me. I do flood forecasting and warning. Jess in our biology team, they do water quality, species monitoring. And then we also have other departments doing school programs. We have conservation areas where you can camp, and tree planting and stewardship projects. So I'll talk predominantly on what I do, which is the flood forecasting and warning network. This is our watershed jurisdiction with those sub-watersheds I mentioned. These little dots indicate monitoring spots or stream gauges that I use to determine if it's flooding. So you're going to notice that all of these, or at least the majority of these stream gauges, are on the east and north branches of the Sydenham River. And we have one stream gauge up here in Lambton Shores, and then as well one in Sarnia. And these two aren't attributed to the Sydenham River. The reason we don't have monitoring networks on those sub-watersheds is because the drainage area there goes directly into the lake and the river. Whereas on the river, we need to know what's happening upstream so that we can determine how flooding is going to happen downstream and impact communities downstream. So that's why you see a heavier presence of stream gauges within the watershed rather than near the coast. We do more than just water levels though. We monitor precipitation, I do snow sampling, we monitor ice when the season allows for it, and then other things such as wind, humidity, you know, tons of different parameters, just whatever we can get our hands on. So I'm also the person typically that puts out the bulletins when it comes to shoreline conditions or river conditions. And these bulletins are actually standardized coming from the provincial government, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So we have three to four different bulletins, however you want to look at it. We have your watershed condition statement with a water safety or a watershed condition statement as a flood outlook. Within the past year, this has been added to become an optional shoreline condition statement. So how this would differ is, and you might see this later this week, if there's a wind event that is going to impact the shoreline, but not impact the watershed or the Sydenham River, I might lean towards the shoreline condition statement compared to a watershed condition statement. So that's just a new change that we've had come to us that helps simplify and better communicate what's happening. And from there, we also can heighten the alert to either a flood watch or a flood warning. Flood watch would be, you know, specific communities are experiencing flooding, or severe, or as I like to call it, catastrophic flooding would be your flood warning. And it's hard to really standardize what events get which, because there's so many different parameters within each event that it's hard to really just make it like a cookie cutter. So the human aspect is really involved in messaging. This is the really exciting stuff. This is what you obviously came here for, is water levels itself. So the closest stream gauge to your area is out of Point Edward, and this is a government-owned stream gauge. So this is not part of the Conservation Authority. This is through Fisheries and Oceans Canada. This data actually goes back to 1918, I believe, is when the period of record started. And I've gone back to at least the 1960s. Thought that was a pretty good scope for you. But some interesting things here that I wanted to point out, and you can see the changes in water levels over the years and how there's a bit of a recurring pattern. So there's a few things we're seeing. We had record low levels in 1964, and that is for all months for the record low, except for December 2012 and January 2013. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then another thing I wanted to point out is for all the Great Lakes here, it's not the best table, I apologize, but you can see for each month on each of the lakes, what year their record high was set. So we can see that in 2020, a lot of record high water levels were set last year. And then these green ones with the asterisks are actually years where high water levels were exceeded in 2019, and then that new record was exceeded again in 2020. We can even go as far back to looking at Lake Superior, Erie, and Ontario, and seeing that 2019, they did set records as well. And I think it's really important to look at the whole scope in all the lakes because they are all connected. And you'll see a map later, but it is one giant watershed, one giant drainage basin. So what happens upstream or downstream of us is going to affect us no matter what. So seeing high levels in the past 3 years is a great indicator of why Lake Huron itself, or Michigan Huron, would see such a large rise. So this is another really interesting point I want to make, and this is precipitation anomalies for the Great Lakes Basin. I understand it's hard to see. And I want to compare this to the water levels going back to 1980. So if we look closely here, we can actually see that in between 1982 and 85, we had a higher amount of precipitation than what would the average be. And then we can compare that to the water levels, and we see that 1986 record highs that we got. So we can see how those are connected there. And then the drop in water levels, we can see here again from 86 to, 89, we had a deficit in precipitation. So the snow and rain inputs were actually lower than average, and averages are over 30 years. So it's not just like a year average that we're looking at 30 years averaged and then comparing what we would expect to what we got. We can actually see that these line up pretty good, actually. It goes up and down. 2012, we see this massive decline in precipitation. And as you heard me say in the previous slide, we had that record low in December 2012 and January 2013. So this dip in precipitation we actually saw in the water levels. What's really interesting is from about 2013, this minor decrease in precipitation won't have a huge effect in the grand scheme of things when you look at 2015 to present or 2020. We actually have a major surplus in precipitation compared to that 30-year average. And then we can see just how that's affected water levels at Point Edward itself, and how they've increased over the years and eventually breaking numerous water level records. If we were to compare water levels from stream gauges on other lakes, we would see similar patterns to this because the drainage basin is connected. And then again, Lake Erie or Lake Ontario had some really high water levels in previous years. Water from Lake Huron can't get out because it's draining into those lakes. So if water levels are high downstream, it's either going to slow the flow or back it up and raise them up. So there's actually a lot of factors here, but I think if we want to keep it simple and the main take-home message of what water levels why, think about precipitation. Do we get a lot? Do we get a little? So water level trends, I alluded to it. Precipitation is a major one, and that's what we'd call your long-term, years and decades. But we can also look to months and weeks as a medium term, and that would be like your spring melt, or another term you might hear is freshet. That means your spring melt, or autumn winds. Actually, that's not a good example, but increased precipitation in other seasons as well would be your medium term effect on water levels. And then short term would be days or hours, and that's mostly linked to your effects on winds. Now I know, water levels have been so high in Lake, can't we do something about it? Not really. I know that there are dams upstream at St. Mary's at the outflow of Lake Superior, where they do control water levels. That really doesn't have much of an effect on water levels in Lake Huron. I couldn't find the exact numbers for it, and I think it was word of mouth, but it's something along the lines of, if they were to change outflows and levels in Lake Superior, like 1 or 2 meters upstream, it's only going to affect water levels downstream on Lake Huron by about 1 centimeter. So there's really no way that they can control water levels upstream. It really comes down to how much precipitation has there been. And unfortunately, if you've had a lot of precipitation and then you have a lot of wind events, that was 2020. I think people were sick of my messages about winds on Lake Huron. But unfortunately, that's what it is, and we really can't control the water levels. And then I just like this graph or this map because it really illustrates that, you know, rain and snow that happens way up here is eventually going to affect us down here. It's going to go out past Montreal. You know, things that are happening in the States are going to affect people up in Kingston. It's just one giant drainage basin. And I think we really need to appreciate water levels with this in mind. Like, it's an incredible system. It can suck, but it's an incredible system to really grapple with. So what are we looking at moving forward? I'm happy to announce that projections have been a bit better than they have been in recent months. 4 months ago, we thought that water levels were going to be near those records that we saw in 2020, which are these black lines. These are your black lines are your high record levels. The low lines are your low levels that we've seen. And then the pink dots are your long-term average. Again, that would be typically 30 years water level averages. Sometimes you can get like the period of record averaged. And then the coordinated forecast is just, the farther away you try to forecast water levels, the more variable it'll be. It's like throwing darts. You have an idea of where you want to put it, but you're never going to put it exactly where you want it to go. So right here, we're the red in 2021. We are lower than we were last year by a decent amount. And the projections over the next 5 months look to be, even on the high level of the projection, below last year's record high levels. So these projections change every month, but as of right now, it looks like we will be lower than we were last year. So I don't know if I talked too fast or if I took too long, but that's the gist of water levels. If you are interested in reading more, there are a lot of really great resources out there available to you. So the water levels I was looking at are the ones you can find online. They're not, you know, any mysterious water levels. Precipitation anomalies, you can find those in climate maps. The US Army Corps of Engineers put out really great bulletins like every month. And I saw one that they put out that explains how we went from drought to extreme highs within 6 years. So if that's something you're interested in, there's a publication out there for you. And then if you're curious further, you can reach me via email. So I hope that was informative.
Thank you. If, by the way, you want to ask questions, there is the chat function down at the bottom, and I'll try to read them off. But meanwhile, Michelle, should we pass on to the next speaker? And Jess, is that you?
You can
That
have
was-
Daniela.
Oh, Daniela?
Sure. Okay, I'll share my screen here. Okay. And we should be good to go. Thumbs up if we can see. Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay. Just gonna move this over. So thank you for lending me your attention. Today, I'll share a little bit about Lake Huron's beaches and dunes and how to best care for them. My name is Danielle and I work for the Lake Huron Center for Coastal Conservation. So for those that are not familiar with the Coastal Center, we're a registered charity. We're based out of Goderich, and we've been working on Lake Huron issues for around 22 years. So Lake Huron beaches and dunes are found along 2 to 3% of the shoreline, 25% of the southeastern shoreline, so that's Sarnia to Tobermory part of the lake. And yet these are the areas of the shore that attract thousands of people each summer for leisure, for recreation, and it places them under a lot of pressure, as most of us here know. Sand beaches and dunes provide a number of ecosystem services, as we like to call them, to shoreline communities. That includes something like water filtration, recreation, and the economic aspect that comes from that, coastal protection, from storms, flooding, and they provide resilience from impacts of a changing climate. So they're pretty important to our shoreline. A sand beach and dune ecosystem relies on change, and that change can be created by wind and created by waves. Our dunes are an important part of the beach cycles. We like to always kind of remind to use the two in tandem, and this diagram just shows a little bit about how that works. So as that sand is washed up onto the shore, it's picked up by the wind and moved along on shore until that vegetation catches the sand and those dunes are able to start to build. And during the high water levels that Emily was just talking about and that we're experiencing, those dunes are naturally eroded away and that sand is carried back out into the lake. And typically when this happens, you'll often get a sandbar forming in the lake, and that can actually protect the shore by lessening some of that energy of the waves that are going to hit the shore. So the most important takeaway from the diagram is that it's a bit of a give and take between the lake, the beach, the dune, and that they work in tandem. So in addition to that, there's something called the littoral drift, and for the supply of sand needed for our healthy beaches and dunes, that's where this comes in. It's the movement of sediment along the coastline. And in Lake Huron, we typically see that littoral drift from north to south. So on the map there on the right, you can see that. That's the general flow of the longshore transport. And there are some exceptions within kind of the Point Clark area and typically around river mouths, but generally speaking, north to south. So that erosion maintains a lot of our beaches along the southern part of Lake Huron. And for example, the area that you're in the Grand Bend, Pinery, Ipperwash Beach area, a lot of that sand is fed from the eroding bluffs, the eroding gullies, and river sections that are north of Grand Bend up to about Goderich area. So pretty interesting to note that, again, what your neighbor does north will end up impacting us downshore. And lake levels, as Emily was just talking about, will also influence how much sand is on that shoreline. So again, thinking back to that cycle diagram that I showed, here's a photo on the left of 1985 when we had high water, we had eroding dunes, narrow beach, and then on the right we have a photo from 2005 with low water, wider beach, and those dunes that are rebuilding themselves towards the lake, kind of encroaching into our beach real estate, as we like to call it. So our sand beach and dune formation is very much connected to the water levels on Lake Huron. And if the dunes and vegetations are removed, that wind-blown sand can easily be carried away. It can go out onto the streets, onto sidewalks, piling up in front of our structures or buildings. And it's typically that fine grain, high quality sand that we all love on the beach, including tourists, that gets blown away as it's the lightest. So again, without that beach grass, our beaches would become very coarse and potentially degraded over time. So the important takeaway from this slide is that the dune grass that we have on the dunes and on the beaches provide an obstacle for that sand to deposit. And without it, those beaches could become very coarse and again, not as attractive to us, to beachgoers, and to potential tourists that visit the area. So here's just a little cross section of a beach and dune vegetation that we see, and that's typically so going from the left from the lake inland, and so going from grasses to shrubs and ground cover, and then back into your wooded area. And the Pinery Provincial Park would be a great example of that succession going inland. And we do have a PDF version of native, non-native, and invasive plants that are typically found on beach and dune systems on our website. So I can definitely forward that along if that would be of interest later on. And so now we'll dive into a little bit of some of the ways that we can enjoy the beaches and the dunes while still maintaining a fairly natural shoreline. So first, we need to get down to the beach, but we know that a straight pathway can actually cause wind to erode that pathway and open it up to some wind-blown areas. So that tends to fragment the dune system. It can start to really widen the path until you have a lot of your dune and your grasses and your sand blowing away. So we actually recommend a narrow S or curved pathway going down from your cottage or your property structure down to the beach, no wider than about 1.2 meters across. And again, that's to help prevent that wind erosion. So as your dominant wind is coming up, it doesn't have that straight path to go up to your property structure. It will actually have an obstacle, such as the vegetation, to get caught. And typically, since our dominant winds are coming kind of from the northwest, we would actually recommend to probably open up your pathway, to have it open up facing south, so that that dominant wind doesn't have a chance to open up. For example, if it's coming from here, it doesn't have a chance to open up this area and kind of blow it out, for lack of better words. And ideally, if we like to limit the number of access pathways. So for example, if you have a neighbor close by, sharing a pathway with your neighbor, just because the more dunes you have, the more access paths you have going through a dune system, the higher the chance of a wind blowout and the system becoming a bit fragmented. Number two, so getting to know the plants that are at your shore is a really great step to knowing what's native, what's non-native, and what's invasive. Native plants along the shoreline provide habitat for wildlife, for insects, birds, but they also provide that great stabilization that I've been talking about. So here you can take a look at the difference in the root lengths between our typical turf grass and American beach grass, or marram grass is another term for it. So that's the main, typically the main grass that we see. And I think the next slide will have a better example or a better photo of the grass. But you can see the difference in the root system, and same with a little blue stem and switchgrass. So likely American beach grass holding a lot more sand down than your turf. And typically when we do see a lot of turf grass going close to the beaches as well, that tends to attract geese, and we know that they can contribute a lot more waste on the beach. So there's numerous benefits to kind of keeping that natural shoreline and trying to keep the grasses that have evolved over many, many years to be there. Here we go. Right. So photo on the right, you've likely seen it. It's probably at, I haven't been to Ipperwash in a while, but most common grass that we find, and the roots can actually grow up to 3 meters long. So it's really great at stabilizing the sand. And again, slowing that erosion. It's cost effective. So we have a couple programs where we actually transplant marram grass as part of our restoration projects. They can improve water quality. So again, without them, we can get into low profile beaches, which can lead to wet beaches. And that just can create ideal conditions for E. coli. So they fluff up the beach. They can keep that high quality sand there. And some other popular plants that we see, long-leaved reed grass, Great Lakes wheatgrass, again, little big blue stems, some other ones. So we do have a good guide, and if anyone has specific questions about that, definitely we can chat about that after. And then on the bottom here is just a growth pattern of marram grass. So it has a parent plant, and then colonies, excuse me, that's spread by rhizomes to the sides here. Next up, removal of invasive species. So from beaches, from dunes, and that can be either by hand and spading, but ensuring that you know what you're removing. So that can either be, you can take a photo of the plant, iNaturalist can be great for that, or reaching out to your conservation authority or to us. before you do remove a lot of a plant. So for example, we have sweet white clover here is a pretty big culprit that we find. Spotted knapweed, which sometimes looks like, sometimes folks get confused with, for example, the pitcher's thistle, which is a species at risk. They both have this kind of pineapple shaped bud here, different in color, but still sometimes it might be a bit confusing. And then obviously our good old Phragmites as well. Installing educational signage. So I'm not sure, again, I think the Coastal Center has worked with Ipperwash in the past on having some signage, but maybe you can correct me after. We do have a lot of educational signage in different sizes for either properties adjacent to the shoreline or for public access access pathways. And just kind of talking a little bit about why they're important and to not disturb them. So you have to be a little bit strategic as to where to put them. You don't want to maybe have, too many signs around, but they can be pretty valuable for those that walk the shore and may not know about this otherwise. And then when it comes to the rehabilitation of a dune system, we can actually use snow fencing. We call it sand fencing because for our purpose, it helps build up sand to help kickstart the process of rebuilding your dune systems. And typically we tend to do this when the lake levels start to recede a little bit and your dune systems start to have a chance to start rebuilding. For example, last year we did try a few spots with sand fencing in the Point Clark area, but again, high water levels and storms, most of those did not end up making it, although the ones that were a bit further back did. So it is a kind of a strategic project. But again, with our sand fencing, that wind-blown sand coming from the lake hits that snow fence, and that slows the energy, at which point it can drop behind the fence and in order and start to kind of rebuild your dunes right behind, and the sand and the wind can actually take it a little bit further to create a second kind of berm as well. But now we need something in this area to keep the sand there, so we would actually go in and plant marram grass or other grasses in that area. Again, otherwise it'll kind of blow away even further inland. So very valuable technique and very cost effective. I mean, snow fencing is not that expensive to go in to the hardware store. So if there's areas along the shore that you think could use some of this to help kickstart that rehabilitation, this is definitely one of those really good cost effective methods. And some other small little tidbits, grooming the beach. So we know that mechanical beach grooming can be extremely damaging. It can loosen that sand and again, cause it to blow off the beach. Hardening of shorelines. So again, groins, seawalls, armor stone, all that kind of stuff. They can be less effective and more expensive than having that natural dune shoreline. Typically, literature has showed that dunes should be about 15 meters wide from the lake inland during high water levels to really protect areas inland from storms. Slowing down the surface water runoff. So again, that could mean having rain gardens, rain diversion, or rain harvesting. Any excess runoff from paved surfaces can cause dunes to erode in areas that maybe they wouldn't have seen that in the past. And knowing before you build. So again, if you're in a dynamic beach zone, contacting your local organizations and authorities to kind of know before planning a shoreline project. So a couple last little tidbits. And here's just a quick example of an area on the top that could use a little naturalization. Again, that turf grass kind of coming right up to the shore. And then at the bottom is a photo of a bit more of a balance between having a natural area and also recreation use. So And we have lots of resources. We work actively with municipalities and local community groups such as yourself. The one I had mentioned, which was the Coastal Plant ID, I can definitely provide a link to that even in the chat after. And we also have what's called a dune restoration guide, and it'll speak a little bit more to the sand fencing and a little bit more about how to do that. We also have a few short videos of, they're a little bit older, we're hoping to update those soon, about how to harvest marram grass and how to transplant as well, so that you're doing it strategically and not harming what's already there. So with that, I just want to say thank you. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Good. I think we got questions coming in for a number of people, but maybe what we ought to do is continue on with the speakers, and then we'll come back to questions at the end.
Okay, you can see my screen. All right, so you can hear me and see me, John. Thumbs up. Awesome. I just wanted to say thanks for having us tonight. My name is Jessica Van Zwoel. I'm the Healthy Watershed Specialist at St. Clair. And when Michelle asked if Emily and I could speak, I knew I had big shoes to fill, and I was very thankful that Daniela could step in for me and share about a lot of the coastal stewardship actions on the ground. I work a lot more with farmers inland. I do some stuff on the shore with landowners and with Sika in the past, but I was very thankful that Daniela could step in and give you some really good tips how to keep your dunes. So I just wanted to say, I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to say thank you to Center Ipperwash Community Association. Every year for the last almost 8 or 9 years, we've had a shoreline cleanup in the fall, in September, and we always have a lot of garbage cleaned up, and I'm just very thankful for the community there. And I know people like Sandra and many others go out daily on their walks, and they collect the garbage that they see that's year-round. So I just want to say on behalf of the authority, we really appreciate the efforts that you guys make. As well with the Ipperwash Frag Fighters, I know a lot of you are volunteers with that organization. Your tireless work always amazes me when I see a lot of the Ipperwash Frag Fighters posts on Facebook, and just really impressive the workforce that you guys pull together. And I have to say, Sandra, I know you're on the phone or on Zoom tonight. I just wanted to say again, St. Clair honored Sandra this spring or this winter through our conservation awards. Sandra has done so much for the Ipperwash community through Phragmites and Phragmites removal, as well as beach cleanups. She's always, whenever I have that event in September, she's there, and I know she's there almost every day picking up garbage as well. So I just wanted to steal a few minutes to say thank you to your community for all the work that you do to keep Lake Huron beautiful. Just a little bit on what I do. I work with landowners all across our region. If they're interested in completing a stewardship project like a tree planting project or implementing a wetland, I try find funds to offset the costs that would be involved in creating a wetland or planting trees. So if you have property more inland and you're interested in planting trees or putting in a wetland, definitely get in contact with me. Generally, the projects we normally work on with landowners and farmers are those windbreaks along the edges of fields, or putting in wetlands or buffers. This is actually up Duffus Creek, right in Lambton Shores. leaving that grass buffer between a land use and the creek just to provide some shade and a bit of erosion prevention and keeping nutrients and other car oils or other pollutants off on the land and out of the water. Just wanted to wrap up again. If you are looking for some assistance with how to build your dunes or where to source grasses or tips to remove Phragmites, although I probably refer to Sandra because she's great on great on that. But if you're ever looking for some advice or some input, definitely you can reach out to us. I also wanted to say, with Emily earlier talking about the bulletins like flood forecasting and that type of information, you can find all of that on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Emily does a great job keeping that up to date on what the lake level status or what the bulletin status is. And with that, I just want to say thanks.
John, if I could just take a minute to thank our guest speakers and then open it up to questions, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank Emily and Daniela and Jessica for joining us tonight. I know they have busy schedules, especially during these challenging times. I found I received a lot of information and I really took away that 2% beach. I'm just so struck by that number and makes me realize how precious our community is and how important and what a wonderful area we live in. So thank you for reaffirming that to us and just for joining us this evening. So I'll turn it back to John for questions and answers.
Okay. Emily, one of the questions that's coming, and it seems to represent a number of others, is going to involve, again, the projection of water levels. And as you said, it said before, that's of interest. One is, once again, any comments you have about what the water levels are likely to be this summer? Second, more specifically, what's the projected precipitation for Lake Superior? And then what's the situation in terms of drainage into the St. Clair River and Lake St. Clair?
Okay, so I'll just quickly start with the one in the chat here from the lovely A. Collins about precipitation upstream, particularly from Lake Superior. So I did provide some links just in the chat, which might be of interest to you, but looking at the data, the past 6 months at least have shown a deficit or at least below average precipitation amongst the Great Lakes Basin. So I think we could probably say that that would be why we're now seeing that lower level, lower water levels compared to last year. If you remember earlier in my presentation, I kind of compared those precipitation anomalies to those spikes or deficits in water levels. So I think looking at the precipitation deficit for the last 6 months, that's why we're seeing lower water levels now. And that's probably why we're also looking at lower projections over the next 5 months. In terms of like projecting or trying to figure out what the water levels are going to be come summer or what the precipitation levels are going to be come, summer, that's really hard to predict. We give it our best shot, and meteorologists try and they give us the long-term forecast, and then they come back the next month and it's completely opposite. So unfortunately, I can't give you any hope to hold on to come the warmer months. But if trends keep going the way that they have been with that below average precipitation, we might see a continued decline in those water levels and potentially drier precipitation conditions. I think there was also something else I read about high versus low cycle. If we were to see 6 to 12 months from now, precipitations to switch and then become above average, we would then see water levels potentially start to rise again. So it's hard to really call if we are on the receding part of a high or low cycle. Water levels are funny like that. They fluctuate so much that it's hard to say where the cycle is going to go. But I think if we keep an eye on what the precipitation does, that'll give us an idea. That said, I'm really simplifying it down to precipitation. It's also important to factor in evaporation rates and if there was ice, how many days there were ice, thickness of ice over the winter on the lakes. That can also impact conditions into the spring. It definitely impacts evaporation rates. So I can't make any definitive predictions for you, unfortunately. And then to note about the movement or the drainage from upstream to downstream, in particular, the like the sediment that ends up in the St. Clair River or the lake. We don't really monitor that. It's a natural process for sediment to be moved through systems. We see erosion and deposition in rivers. You know, the older the river gets, the more meandering you'll see in a river. And it's the same sort of thing it's normal for that transport to move from one lake down a connecting channel to another lake. And it's normal for that deposition. That's really a question of like system hydraulics. That would be better answered by an engineer, which I am not. But we don't really see deposition of sediment downstream being a concern or an impediment to the flow of water levels out of our watershed system. So I don't know if that covered all the bases. I'm happy to talk more.
I think that it largely did, as long as you're saying that you can't give definitive predictions. You've touched on this, but there is one question that seems to be coming in, and that is, given the best guess at reduced lake levels, what does that mean in terms of how many more feet of beach we're likely to have? Is there any way to answer that question?
There is no way to answer that. I mean, we could see a 20 to 30 centimeter drop in water levels, and you might see that open up on your beaches. But then a windstorm could come, and wind is really great at, you know, surging those water levels, which causes flooding of your beach. So sure, you might have maybe a foot or two more beach thanks to the water levels, but come a windstorm, you're going to see that beach disappear from that wind-driven flooding. And then you might also see increased erosion. So that's the funny thing about my job is the forecast says something at 7 p.m. and then tomorrow at 8 a.m. It's totally changed. So I try to take it day by day.
One question comes up in terms of building up the dune again. And the question is, with the large drop-offs we've got right now, where the water is eaten into the dunes, what's the best recommendation in terms of how to handle that drop-off?
Yeah, I think I saw a comment about potentially moving the sand down to the beach, but what we recommend, and we're seeing a lot of this even in the Goderich and North area, unfortunately trying to find a different pathway down, leaving those drop-offs as they are. That can happen within one storm system, and it can also be gone after one major storm system. So if we're talking like a few feet, the likelihood of that that sand being gradually brought back to the beach is quite high. So kind of our best answer to that is leaving it as it is and trying to find a different way down to access the beach.
Wow.
We do have some other specific questions in terms of climate change and also in terms of the sand fences. But I think what we can do is prepare a kind of a question answer coming out of this to come back to people afterward. And so if other people have questions that you want to send in to info@Ipperwash Community, please go ahead and do that, and we'll get out answers as quickly as we can. There was also one question as to whether the recording will be available, and if so, how. And that will be on the website. And again, we'll send out information on that. Let me, at this point, we're getting close to 8 o'clock, turn it back over to Michelle and to the speakers for any final comments.
Thanks, John. I just want to say again, thank you so much to these incredible women. And also thank you to all the people that turned out tonight. We had over 70 participants, which is great and says a lot about our community. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, let me add my thanks as well. And I'd agree, from a muted applause.
Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciated it.
Very good. And that concludes the meeting.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Take care.